Have you ever felt trapped in a nightmare, unable to tell if it's real or just a trick of the mind? I'm Eldon Kessler, an artist whose dreams have always been vivid, unsettling. But one night, I crossed a line, entering a dream so disturbingly real that it blurred the boundary between reality and madness. It began as any other sleep, but quickly, an eerie clarity took hold. I could feel the cold air prickling my skin, hear the silence pressing down around me. This wasn't like my other dreams. No, this was something darker, more ancient. It was as if I'd stepped into a place waiting for me, a place I was never meant to find. There I was, standing at the edge of an unending forest cloaked in mist, the trees towering like silent guardians. I felt a chill creep down my spine as an inexplicable dread settled over me, growing with each breath I took. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, twisting and contorting as if they had minds of their own. My hands were trembling, yet I couldn't look away. I couldn't wake up. The silence was deafening, a suffocating void that made my heart race faster, beating like a drum in the eerie stillness. Each beat echoed in my chest, reminding me that, somehow, I wasn't alone. In that moment, a whisper broke the silence, faint, barely there, but unmistakably real. A voice calling my name, Eldon. It was low, almost mournful, as if coming from the depths of the forest itself. I turned, desperate to see who or what was out there, but there was nothing, only the dense, suffocating darkness. My skin prickled with a cold sweat, and I took a step back, my eyes scanning the shadows that seemed to grow darker, denser, with each passing second. Fear took hold of me, twisting into something primal, urging me to run, to escape. But deep down I knew. Whatever was calling me didn't want me to leave. It wanted me to come closer. Before we continue, if you're captivated by stories that straddle the line between reality and the unknown, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button. This tale isn't for the faint of heart. What I encountered at night in the woods is something that still haunts me, a nightmare that doesn't fade with the morning light. For those of you brave enough to listen, join me as I unravel this mystery, one that lingers just beyond the edge of sleep and sanity. It all began on what seemed like an ordinary night, the kind where you fall asleep without a second thought, expecting nothing but rest. Yet, as my eyes closed, I felt an unsettling pull, a sensation as if something, or someone, was drawing me into a different world, a darker reality. In an instant, I found myself standing in a forest unlike any I'd ever seen. The trees were twisted ancient, their bark rough, and scarred with symbols I couldn't decipher, each marking exuding an eerie, almost pulsing light. The ground was covered in damp, decaying leaves, and the air was thick with the sickly sweet scent of rotting earth. It clung to my skin, sinking into my lungs with every breath, turning the simple act of breathing into a struggle. I stood motionless, trying to make sense of this place. Shadows loomed all around, as if alive, moving with silent intent just beyond the reach of my vision. And then, there was the sound, a faint rustling that seemed to come from everywhere at once, like countless whispers twisting through the trees, echoing off the hollow trunks. It was a sound that didn't belong, too faint to decipher, yet sharp enough to send a shiver crawling up my spine. With every step I took, the forest floor shifted beneath me, soft and yielding, like I was walking on a bed of bones. The sensation was disturbingly real, each step a reminder that this was no ordinary dream. This place was old, ancient in a way that defied time, filled with the kind of darkness that feels alive waiting. A strange sensation of déjà vu gripped me as I moved deeper into the trees, as if I had been here before, perhaps in another life or some buried fragment of memory. Every fiber of my being told me to turn back, but a force beyond my control pulled me forward. I felt watched, as though unseen eyes were following my every move, analyzing, judging. I could feel them on my skin, a prickling awareness that made my heart race, my mouth dry with fear. Suddenly, a cold breeze brushed past me, carrying a smell that was oddly familiar yet deeply unsettling, a mixture of damp earth and something metallic, like blood. As I took another hesitant step, the ground crunched beneath my feet, and I realized it wasn't just leaves I was walking on. Bones, small, brittle bones, scattered like forgotten remnants of those who had wandered here before. Each crunch echoed in the silence, a morbid reminder that I was somewhere I didn't belong. Then, from somewhere in the distance, I heard a low, drawn-out groan. It wasn't human, nor was it animal. It was something in between, a sound filled with age and hunger. I felt the overwhelming urge to run, but I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the ground, as though the forest itself held me captive, trapping me in its cold, silent grasp. In the midst of my paralysis, my gaze fell upon a narrow path winding through the trees, overgrown and almost hidden from view. The path seemed to lead somewhere deeper into the darkness, where the trees were thicker, the air colder. And though every instinct screamed at me to turn back, I felt an inexplicable pull toward it, a force that made it impossible to resist. I took a shaky breath, feeling my pulse throb in my temples, and began to follow the path, my steps slow and reluctant, each one pulling me further from any hope of waking. As I walked, the forest grew even more oppressive. The trees seemed to close in, their branches stretching out like skeletal fingers, reaching for me. In the silence, a faint hum began to fill the air, a melody twisted and wrong, like a lullaby sung by a voice that had long since forgotten the tune. And then, just when I thought the tension could get no worse, I saw it, a shadow moving just ahead, slipping between the trees. It was human-shaped, yet something was off, as if its limbs moved in ways they shouldn't, stretching and bending in unnatural angles. I stopped, heart pounding, watching as it disappeared down the path. I felt an icy terror settle over me, but it was too late to turn back. As I continued down the winding path, the air around me thickened, each step echoing in a silence that felt almost sentient. The deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to close in, its trees warping into grotesque shapes, like twisted figures frozen in silent agony. Shadows clung to every branch, dancing just at the edge of my vision, and I realized they were watching me, shifting in the darkness, as if assessing my every move. There was no longer any doubt. I was being observed by something beyond comprehension, something ancient and malevolent that seemed to inhabit every inch of this place. The unsettling rustling grew louder, a whispering chorus that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, voices that hissed and murmured in a language I couldn't understand. My skin prickled with an icy dread, my mind racing with questions I was too afraid to answer. Suddenly, I felt the weight of something pressing down on me, like invisible hands pushing me deeper into the forest. The urge to turn back, to flee, was overwhelming, but I couldn't resist the inexplicable pull that drew me forward, deeper into this nightmare that felt more real than anything I'd ever experienced. Ahead of me, a clearing opened, and I stopped, breath catching in my throat. Scattered around were objects that seemed out of place. A cracked mirror leaning against a tree, an old lantern half buried in the mud, and, disturbingly, a torn dress hanging from a low branch, swaying gently in the non-existent wind. Each item looked abandoned, forgotten by those who had come before me, as if marking the lives of people who had been here and never left. The air grew colder, and as I reached out to touch the mirror, a faint, ice-cold handprint appeared on its surface, pressing from the other side. My own reflection was distorted, as if something was behind me, peering over my shoulder. I spun around, but there was nothing there, only the oppressive darkness and the sound of my own ragged breathing. As I backed away from the mirror, I noticed that the shadows around me were shifting. Shapes began to emerge, indistinct figures that seemed to hover just beyond the light, watching me with eyes that glowed faintly in the gloom. I could feel their gaze, a piercing, invasive sensation that seemed to dig into my mind, unearthing fears I'd buried long ago. And then, in the silence, a soft, rhythmic tapping began. It echoed through the clearing, a hollow, relentless sound that seemed to grow louder with each beat, like a heartbeat pounding in the very earth beneath me. My own pulse matched it, each thud vibrating in my chest, sending waves of cold fear through my veins. In a sudden flash of movement, I saw something flicker at the edge of my vision, a figure, pale and gaunt, standing half-hidden among the trees. Its eyes were empty voids, black holes that swallowed the light, staring directly at me with a gaze so intense it felt like it could pierce my soul. I tried to look away, but my body refused to obey, frozen by the sheer terror that gripped me. The figure raised one skeletal hand, pointing down the path, a silent command that filled me with dread. Despite every instinct telling me to turn and run, my legs moved on their own, carrying me further down the twisted trail as the figure watched, its eyes never leaving me. The path grew narrower, the trees closing in until their branches clawed at my skin, each scratch a cold, stinging reminder that there was no escape. The whispers followed, louder now, almost chanting my name, Eldon. Eldon. Their voices melded into one, a haunting echo that filled the forest. I felt as if the very forest had come alive, its roots and branches reaching out to trap me, to pull me into its depths, where the shadows would consume me whole. And just as I was ready to surrender to the terror, a glimmer of light appeared ahead, a faint glow spilling from a doorway partially hidden by the trees. The door was slightly ajar, revealing only darkness within, yet the pull toward it was irresistible, a siren's call that promised answers or oblivion. With a deep, shuddering breath, I reached out and pushed the door open, stepping into a darkness that felt as though it would swallow me whole. The air inside was thick and heavy, filled with the scent of decay and something far worse. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw strange symbols etched into the walls, symbols that seemed to shift and writhe as I looked at them. And then, from somewhere deep within the shadows, a voice whispered, "Welcome home, Eldon." The words were slow, dripping with a sinister familiarity that made my blood run cold. This wasn't just a dream. It was a trap, a haunting invitation to a place I might never escape. Standing in the center of that dark, suffocating room, I could feel the weight of the air pressing down on me, thick with the scent of decay and something faintly metallic, like blood. My eyes adjusted slowly to the dim light, and that's when I saw it, a figure, barely visible in the shadows, sitting motionless in the corner. It was cloaked in darkness, its outline barely distinguishable, but something about it was unmistakably wrong. It exuded a presence that filled every inch of the room, a cold, hollow energy that seemed to drain the warmth from my body. I couldn't move, couldn't look away. My breathing slowed, each shallow breath a struggle as my gaze remained fixed on that dreadful form. Then, as if sensing my stare, the figure shifted, its head lifting just slightly, revealing a face twisted and hollow, with sunken eyes that seemed to be made of pure shadow. They weren't eyes that saw. They were voids, dark and empty, staring straight through me with a chilling intensity that pierced my soul. My entire body locked up in fear, my legs rooted to the floor as an icy dread spread through my veins. I tried to scream, to make any sound, but my voice was trapped, smothered by the crushing silence of that room. All I could hear was my own heartbeat, pounding louder and faster, a desperate drumbeat echoing in the dead air. Suddenly, the figure rose, its movements slow and unnatural, as if it was piecing itself together from broken fragments, limbs contorting and bending in ways that defied reason. It seemed to grow as it moved, casting a long, dark shadow that stretched toward me, enveloping the floor like a spreading pool of ink. I was paralyzed, unable to turn away as it advanced, each step closer filling me with a dread so powerful it felt like I was drowning in it. Every instinct screamed at me to wake up, to escape, but the dream held me captive, chaining me to this nightmare that was all too real. Then, in a sudden, horrifying motion, the figure lunged forward, reaching out with a hand that was more claw than flesh. Its fingers were elongated, tipped with nails that seemed to glisten in the dim light, sharp and deadly. As it reached for me, I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the touch of something cold and lifeless. In that split second, everything went silent, the air around me thick with anticipation, and I hoped, that maybe I had escaped. But when I opened my eyes again, I was no longer in the room. I was back in my bed, drenched in sweat, my heart hammering as if I'd just run a marathon. My room was dark, the familiar shapes of my belongings barely visible in the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the window. I took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to shake off the remnants of the nightmare. But something was wrong. The air was different, heavy, as though the darkness from the dream had followed me here. I scanned the room, half expecting to see the figure standing in the corner, waiting. And then I saw it, the mark, faint but unmistakable, burned into the floorboards beside my bed. It was the same symbol I had seen etched into the trees, the same twisted mark that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. A wave of cold horror washed over me. This wasn't just a nightmare. The figure, the darkness, that terrible mark, it had all followed me back. The line between dream and reality had blurred, leaving me stranded in a waking nightmare I couldn't escape. I was trapped, caught between worlds, with a shadow lingering over me, waiting patiently, as if it knew this was only the beginning. The days that followed were a haze of sleepless nights and creeping paranoia. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the pull back into that nightmare, as if the forest were a living thing, reaching out, trying to reclaim me. Shadows seemed to cling to the corners of my vision even in daylight, and I could feel a constant chill prickling my skin, a reminder that the figure from my dream might still be watching. The symbol I'd found burned into the floor near my bed was impossible to ignore, a twisted mark that seemed to pulse faintly, like a heartbeat from another world. Desperate for answers, I knew I had to uncover the meaning of that symbol, to understand what had followed me out of the dream. I began my search online, sifting through old forums and obscure websites, looking for anything that could explain this curse that seemed to bind me. After hours of reading, I stumbled upon a local legend, one that spoke of a place known as the Forgotten Path. The tales described a forest path hidden from the eyes of most, only visible to those marked by something dark and ancient. It was said that those who found it were cursed to wander its twisted trails, lost between worlds, their souls trapped in a cycle of terror that followed them even into the waking world. The more I read, the colder I felt, as if each word were a step deeper into the nightmare. But it was when I found an old newspaper article that my heart truly sank. It described a series of disappearances from decades ago, all tied to a stretch of forest on the outskirts of town. The victims shared a chilling similarity. They all reported seeing the same twisted symbol before they vanished, a mark that appeared mysteriously in their homes, their belongings, even carved into their skin. My hands trembled as I scanned the article, the photograph of the symbol a perfect match for the one burned into my floor. The words seemed to blur before my eyes as dread filled my chest, a cold certainty that my nightmare had a foothold in reality. Compelled to learn more, I decided to visit the local library, hoping to find any other accounts that might explain this curse. As I combed through dusty records and yellowed journals, I found more tales of the Forgotten Path, stories whispered in fear by those lucky enough to escape its lure. Each account was disturbingly similar. Dreams of a dark forest, shadowed figures with hollow eyes, and the unshakable feeling of being watched. But most terrifying of all were the reports of what followed. The lingering presence, the constant chill, the sense that something was always just behind them, waiting for the right moment to strike. Then, buried in the pages of an old journal, I found a name, Lenora Blackwood. She was the last person documented to have encountered the path and survived. The journal entries were sparse, but what I read was chilling. Lenora spoke of hearing whispers even in her waking hours, seeing the symbol etched into her walls, and feeling a cold hand on her shoulder when she was alone. Her last entry was a warning, scrawled in frantic, uneven letters. Once you're marked, there is no escape. It watches. It waits. With each discovery, the terror grew. I realized that this was not merely a dream. It was an invitation, a lure into something beyond my understanding. And now, like those before me, I was marked, my fate intertwined with that of the forgotten path. The boundaries between reality and nightmare were crumbling, and the figure from my dream was no longer confined to the shadows of sleep. It was here, in my world, drawing closer with every passing day. Driven by a mix of fear and desperation, I knew I couldn't ignore the pull of the forest any longer. The nightmares had blurred into reality, and every waking moment was haunted by whispers just beyond hearing, shadows that danced when I wasn't looking, and the constant, chilling presence of the symbol that seemed to follow me like a curse. With trembling hands, I packed a flashlight and a few essentials, steeling myself for what lay ahead. I was no longer certain if I was entering the forest by choice or being compelled, lured by a darkness that wouldn't rest until I returned to the place it had first found me. The journey to the forest was shrouded in silence, the kind that felt oppressive, pressing in from all sides. The trees loomed overhead, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the light, casting long shadows across the path. As I crossed into the forest, a shiver crawled up my spine, each step feeling heavier, as if the ground itself resisted my presence. The deeper I went, the colder the air became, a frigid bite that seemed to seep into my bones, chilling me from the inside out. My flashlight flickered in the dimness, illuminating nothing but more twisted trees and shadows that seemed to move on their own. And then I saw it, a figure standing motionless at the edge of my light. My heart skipped a beat, my breath catching in my throat as I took in the gaunt form of an old woman, her eyes hollow and empty, reflecting a darkness that felt alive. "You shouldn't have come," she murmured, her voice like dead leaves rustling in the wind. She introduced herself as Lenora Blackwood, the woman whose journal I'd found. Her face was worn, her skin pale, as though drained of life, and her gaze was filled with a sorrow so deep it was almost tangible. She told me she, too, had once been lured by the path, but unlike me, she had found a way to escape, if only barely. She warned that once marked by the path, one's soul is bound to it, forever caught between worlds, haunted by what lies within. Her words ignited a new terror within me, a realization that I might never truly escape, that I might be doomed to wander in the grip of this curse until my very mind unraveled. Lenora explained that the figure in my dreams was more than a mere specter. It was the forest's guardian, a keeper of the path, who sought souls to feed the endless shadows. Her eyes met mine with a look of pity, and she told me that I was not the first to be marked, nor would I be the last. There was no comfort in her words, only a dreadful acceptance of what awaited me. As I ventured further, the trees grew even closer, their branches scraping against my skin like skeletal fingers reaching out to claim me. The whispers grew louder, now distinct words that seemed to form sentences, urging me forward, taunting me with fragments of memories that didn't belong to me. Remember, return, belong. The forest felt alive, breathing, as though it were aware of my every thought, feeding on my fear and despair. Shadows seemed to coalesce in the corners of my vision, forming shapes that flickered in and out of existence. The coldness grew unbearable, sinking deep into my bones, draining every ounce of warmth from my body until I was shivering uncontrollably. Suddenly, I stumbled upon a small clearing where a single object lay in the dirt, a cracked mirror, half buried and covered in grime. But when I looked into its shattered surface, I saw something that nearly stopped my heart. My reflection, standing in the forest, but behind me was the shadowed figure, its hollow eyes locked onto me, a twisted smile stretching across a face that defied reason. My reflection didn't match my movements. It was its own entity, mocking me, trapped in a nightmare loop that felt disturbingly real. I stepped back, my breath quickening, my chest tight with terror, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the reflection, as though it held me captive. In that moment, I knew that I was no longer simply a visitor. I was becoming part of the forest, woven into its darkness, my soul bound to its twisted will. The realization hit me with a sickening dread. The path had lured me in, and now it had no intention of letting me leave. At the heart of the forest, the trees parted to reveal a decrepit, ancient stone altar bathed in an unnatural, sickly green glow. Every instinct screamed for me to turn back, to run, but my legs felt like they were under the forest's control, each step dragging me forward as if drawn by an invisible chain. I could feel the weight of countless eyes upon me, lurking in the shadows, and every breath I took was thick with decay, as though the very air was rotting. My hands shook, my heart thundered in my chest, but I couldn't stop myself from approaching the altar. There, resting on the cold, moss-covered stone, lay an old, weathered book, its cover marked with the same twisted symbol that had haunted my nightmares. Hesitantly, I reached out, my fingers brushing against the rough, brittle surface of the book. The instant I touched it, a surge of cold flooded through me, an icy current that seemed to pull at my very soul. My vision blurred, and I felt as though I was spiraling into a deep, dark void. Shadows began to rise from the ground, swirling around me like a living fog, and from within them, faces began to emerge, faces twisted in silent agony, each one bearing the same hollow, empty eyes. They were the souls of those who had walked this path before, their expressions frozen in fear, as if caught in the moment of their last breath. Then, the ground beneath me trembled, and a figure began to materialize from the shadows behind the altar. It was the entity from my dreams, now fully formed, towering over me with an otherworldly presence. Its eyes were nothing but voids, deep and endless, pulling at me, drawing me in as if they could swallow me whole. Its face, pale and gaunt, held an unnatural stillness, a twisted mockery of humanity that made my stomach churn. As it stepped closer, its voice filled the air, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to resonate within my bones. "You came to seek answers," it hissed, each word sending a fresh wave of terror through me. "But some truths are best left hidden." In its hand, the figure held an object that seemed both ancient and disturbingly familiar, an amulet carved with the same symbol I had seen in my nightmares. It raised the amulet, and as the light from the altar touched it, a piercing pain shot through my head. Memories flooded my mind, memories that weren't mine, of lives lived and lost in the shadow of the forest. I could see flashes of people walking this path, each one lured in by the same haunting dreams, only to vanish, claimed by the darkness. And then, in one horrifying instant, I realized the truth. The forest wasn't just a place. It was a gateway, a trap that consumed the souls of those who dared to enter. The figure leaned closer, its cold, lifeless breath brushing against my face. "You have a choice," it whispered, its voice like dead leaves scraping over stone. "Stay and join the others, or bring me another to take your place." My heart pounded as the weight of its words settled over me. I was faced with an impossible decision: to sacrifice another soul to free myself, or to accept my fate, becoming yet another lost spirit in this cursed place. The shadows seemed to close in, pressing against me, waiting for my answer. I looked down at the book still clutched in my hands, the twisted symbol seeming to pulse as if alive, reminding me that I, too, was now part of this dark legacy. My throat tightened, fear clawing at me, but I knew that I couldn't bring myself to condemn someone else to this fate. With a trembling voice, I whispered, I won't do it." The figure's expression twisted into a grim smile, a look of satisfaction and dark amusement. "Very well," it murmured, its voice echoing in my mind. "Then you will stay forever." In that moment, the shadows surged forward, enveloping me, filling my lungs, my mind, my very soul with darkness. I felt myself slipping away, the forest swallowing me whole, my essence becoming part of the path. The last thing I saw was the figure's hollow eyes, watching me with a hunger that seemed eternal, as if it knew this was only the beginning. And then everything went black. When I came to, it was not in the clearing, but in a stark, white room that felt sterile and unfamiliar. The harsh light above me buzzed softly, and the faint smell of antiseptic clawed at my senses, pulling me from the depths of the abyss. I sat up, disoriented and gasping, the remnants of my nightmare clawing at the edges of my mind. As my vision cleared, I could see figures in white coats moving around me, their faces obscured by surgical masks, their voices a distant hum. A wave of confusion washed over me. How had I gotten here? What had happened in the forest? I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat, a sense of dread tightening around my chest. Just then, the door swung open, and a doctor entered, his expression grave. "You had us worried," he said, but his words felt detached, as though he were speaking from a great distance. "You were found unconscious in the woods. Can you tell us what happened?" I opened my mouth to reply, but the memories came rushing back with terrifying clarity. The forest, the figure, the choice I had made. My heart raced as I remembered the shadows closing in, the darkness that promised to swallow me whole. Where am I? I managed to croak, my voice hoarse and trembling. The doctor glanced at the clipboard in his hand, frowning as if my confusion was merely a symptom to be noted. "You're safe now," he said, but I could see the doubt flickering in his eyes. "You were in the woods for 2 days. My stomach churned at the thought of being trapped in that nightmare for so long, but worse still was the gnawing realization that the darkness had not been vanquished. It still lingered, waiting for the right moment to return. Panic surged through me, and I swung my legs over the side of the bed, ready to bolt. The shadows, the figure. "I have to go back," I shouted, but the doctor stepped forward, concern etched on his face. "You need to calm down. There's nothing out there but trees." His voice was soothing, but it felt like a lie, a thin veil covering the truth I could feel in my bones. I had seen it. I had felt it. The forest was alive, a living entity that thrived on fear and despair. I could still hear the whispers echoing in my mind, the promises of shadows waiting just beyond the light. As the doctor spoke, I caught sight of something glimmering on the floor, a small, metallic object that had slipped from my pocket. I reached down, and my fingers brushed against the cold surface of the amulet, the one that had been in the figure's possession. A surge of terror coursed through me. It had followed me here. I could feel it, the weight of it, the malevolence wrapped around it like a shroud. I clenched it in my palm, and as I did, a chill swept through the room, the air growing heavy with an unnatural presence. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the shadows in the corners of the room deepened, twisting and curling like smoke. I could hear the whispers again, louder this time, a chorus of voices weaving through the air, urging me to join them. "Eldon, Eldon, come back." The familiar call pierced through my consciousness, igniting a primal fear within me. The doctor's voice faded into the background, his words drowned out by the insistent murmurs that seemed to surround me, wrapping around me like a noose. I felt myself slipping back into that dark place, the boundaries of reality warping once again. The hospital room blurred, and in its place, I saw the forest, the twisted trees, the altar glowing ominously in the night. The figure loomed larger than before, its eyes more hollow, its presence more commanding. "You cannot escape," it seemed to say, its voice resonating within me, filling the very air I breathed. The walls of the hospital began to dissolve, and I was falling, tumbling back into the nightmare I thought I had left behind. As I fell, I heard the doctor's voice trying to pull me back to consciousness, but it was too late. I was back in the depths of the forest, the shadows closing in around me, and the figure's hollow gaze fixed upon me with insatiable hunger. I was trapped, caught between two worlds, both reality and nightmare intertwining in a sinister dance. Was this a new beginning or an eternal loop of torment? The truth was as chilling as the darkness that surrounded me. The nightmare might never end. If you felt the call of the shadows or seen the faintest glimmer of something lurking just beyond your sight, then you understand. The boundaries of our world are fragile, and sometimes they can break. Join me in this chilling exploration of fear and mystery. Subscribe to the channel, share your theories in the comments, and remember, sometimes the nightmares we think we've escaped are just waiting for the right moment to return. And perhaps we're never truly free.